Hello, I'm Ngamisile Pamela Ngubane, and this is the Entity Dynamics podcast. Entity Dynamics is a culture development consultancy where we believe that culture creates behavior and behavior creates reality. So, the title of this video is A Note on Decolonization. And I think I might have to do more than one part because as I was been thinking about it, it looks like it's quite a big topic. Anyway, so when I talk about decolonization, like I did in my previous video where I said, if you're not making African languages the lingua franca, then you can't really talk about decolonization, because then the culture that determines economic productivity and economic behavior is going to be the culture of your colonizers if you're using their language to conduct yourself, because language is the primary transmitter of culture. Okay, so in terms of decolonization, I think, most people agree that it's a myth, essentially. It didn't happen. It happened and if it did happen, we're talking extremely superficially, okay? We're talking about basically a change of the administrator of the system, So we went from white administrators who had racist segregationist laws to black administrators of the system who opened up the segregated spaces to black people and allowed economic participation for black people in an economy that was previously closed off for them. But on the social level, and it is from the social level that culture is developed. And that culture informs how we conduct ourselves economically and politically. On the social level, we can't talk about decolonization. And I think this is really what the kids at the universities were talking about when they said roads must fall, right? They were saying we have to move away from seeing Western civilization as the pinnacle of human thought and human achievement. Okay. However, I would take it a step further, because if we are going to only focus on the colonial period of, let's say, 1492 to 1994, if you want to say, then we, I think, are also missing a big issue in terms of what it is that created the colonial movement before Christopher Columbus sailed from Spain to the Americas, okay? Because there's a worldview which permeated Europe before Columbus, and it was very much driven by the Roman Catholic Church, which also saw European peoples being colonized as well, where their worldviews, their cultures were replaced by the Holy Roman Empire worldview, for example, basically, So I think decolonization, and this was very much on display at the World Conference Against Racism in 2001 in Durban, right, where they were talking about the need for reparations, etc., and the need for decolonization to take an economic turn, right, because it hasn't. But the reason why it hasn't is because socially, we still very much identify with the idea that the Western European thought systems, as presented to us very much from the perspective of European elites, is the highest form of human civilization, And the reason why I say this is a human issue is because, like I pointed out in a previous video, if you look at the Industrial Revolution, the European peasantry were very much exploited by the European aristocracy when the Industrial Revolution happened. They were tricked off their land in many respects, especially like in England. They were tricked off their land and basically forced into the mines and the factories, and their wives forced into houses as domestic workers. Same thing that happened here in South Africa when the hut tax was imposed in 1910, which Chief Mbambata rebelled against. That tax was to force African natives into labor in factories and on farms and in houses, right? Because that hut tax could not be paid in kind. It couldn't be paid with a bag of corn or with a sheep or some chickens or whatever. It had to be paid in actual shillings, British shillings, which could only be earned by working for a British person, because they were the only ones who had access to that money. Natives couldn't mint their own shillings based on the resources that they had. The shillings belonged to the colonial overlord, right? And so in order to earn those shillings, they had to work for the people who owned the money. You know what I'm saying? So what I'm saying is, like, this is a global system which undermines humanity across the board. Okay, it's yes, we do need to make our languages the lingua franca. Yes, we do need to ensure that our minerals benefit the people who live in the land where those minerals are mined, but we also need to interrogate the social constructs that uphold the current economic and political system. Okay, because if we're going to have a culture where we believe that hierarchies amongst human beings are valid, outside of, like, someone made money, okay, and now they're very wealthy, okay, they're working in the system. I'm not talking about, taxing the rich type of thing, even though if the rich are making their money off exploiting people, by all means, tax them, But if a person makes money and he runs a company respecting the rights of his workers, why should he be taxed like some exploitative psycho? You know what I mean? So I think we have to obviously look at that. So, but I'm talking about if you're going to have a situation where we have been conditioned as human beings to believe that power has a right to be exploitative, then that's a serious problem, where we believe that hierarchies should enable those in power to be shielded from accountability, and accountability must become the domain of those lower down in the rungs, then we have a problem, So, and I think someone in the Roads Must Fall movement said something similar to this, if I'm not mistaken, that it is about fundamentally rethinking human interactions on a grand scale, because yes, let's say, we have all our minerals nationalized and only the Black people of South Africa are able to benefit from those minerals. But what is the culture that exists in that society? You know what I'm saying? Are we still believing that the higher ups have a right to exploit loopholes in the system to siphon that money for their own use and not take care of the needs of the people? Because if we're going to talk about decolonization, then we need to decolonize ourselves from elitism. And this is where, you see the ugly face of the lack of social reform that has not been achieved by the decolonization movement. Because, like in South Africa, for example, elites in this country believe that they have a right to siphon money from tax money that is supposed to be going towards schools development, for example, and use it for their own personal needs. That is elitism. And I think there's a lot to be said about the fact that traditional leaders in South Africa and around Africa were sidelined in the decolonization process and in the anti-apartheid process. And I'm going to carry on with this in part 2.